Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us for today's webinar, Prove It or Lose It, Using Attack Path Validation for Proactive Security. I'm Stacy Nosen, Senior Director of Content and Communications at SafeBreach, and I'll be the moderator today. First, I would love to introduce you to our speakers. We're joined by Shelly Zucker, Product Manager here at SafeBreach, and Andrew Kozma, SafeBreach Technical Account Manager for the Americas. Before we get started, I wanted to make a note of a few housekeeping items. So first, today's webinar is being recorded, and an on-demand version will be shared with you after the session via email. So keep an eye out for that and feel free to share it with others who you think might be interested in the discussion that happens today. And second, we'd love to hear from you during today's presentation. If you have a question for Shelly or Andrew, please send it through the questions panel in the Zoom webinar interface. We've set aside some time specifically to address those at the end of the session, but please know if we run out of time and we don't get to your questions, someone from our team will follow up with you after the presentation. And with that, I'll hand it over to you, Shelly, to get us started.
Hi, everyone. So let's start with a quick introduction. So before we dive into Propagate, which is the reason that we're here today, a quick reminder of who we are and what we do here at SafeBreach. So SafeBreach, we're one of the pioneers in the breach and attack simulation space in general, and today we're proud to be the most widely used continuous security validation platform in the industry. What that means is that we help organizations safely execute real attack scenarios in their own environment. That is done in a continuous way so they can see exactly where controls hold up, where they don't, and how to prioritize remediation based on this very real risk that we're simulating. A big part of the strength of SafeBreach comes from our threat research team, SafeBreach Labs, which is globally recognized, and from our massive attack playbook that's based on the MITRE ATT&CK framework and incorporates real malware from the wild, along with our team's original research attacks. So the playbook currently includes more than 30,000 attack methods, and it grows constantly as new threats emerge, new tactics and techniques are added to the MITRE ATT&CK framework, etc. SafeBreach is also recognized as a leader in what we now refer to as the adversarial exposure validation, basically giving defenders the same level of visibility that attackers have. And over the years, that leadership has been acknowledged through multiple industry recognitions, and now this is where we're going to start talking about Propagate. This is like the start of it. So that's the foundation we're building on as we go into today's session. And I think we can continue. So when we talk about exposure validation, we're really talking about answering the questions that every security team wrestles with. Like, are our security controls actually working the way we expect them to? How resilient are the systems that matter most to the business? And when a major new threat makes headlines, how are we supposed to validate our protection against it? How exposed are we to something similar? These are the kind of questions that drive our day-to-day decisions, like where to focus our security investments, how to justify budget to a specific sector, and how to communicate real risks to leadership, like I said earlier. So exposure validation also helps us to think like an attacker. How could an adversary actually move through the environment to reach critical assets? Ultimately, it's about understanding whether we're managing cyber risk appropriately and effectively, not just in theory and in checklists, but in practice and actually simulating and executing the attacks that are seen in the wild. So SafeBreach Propagate. Propagate is SafeBreach's enterprise-grade attack path validation product. So what attack path validation product does is models how real intrusions unfold. It links reconnaissance, port scanning, credential harvesting, and lateral movement, as Andrew will soon go into a conditional process, where each step adapts to what we learn in your environment in the previous steps. Unlike BAS, which is non-dependent, attack path validation is contextual and is driven by the previous attacks. That tailoring is critical because it reflects your assets and their discovery phases, your policy, and your control stack, and how it handles these attacks. So the findings are operationally actionable because they are actually derived from these attacks results. We built Propagate with enterprise design partners, including Fortune 500 companies, meeting every 2 weeks with them to run it hands-on, gather feedback, harden workflows, safeguards, everything needed. Propagate is about going deeper than the testing techniques that BAS allows. It allows you to validate the full attack path and get this clear guidance on how to remediate and reduce the risk in a way that is identical to what an attacker would do. So it's no more simulating. This is the execution. I think we can continue over to Andrew for the customer perspective of Propagate.
Excellent. First and foremost, thank you everybody for your time and your attention. Really appreciate it. Let's dive right into the customer perspective. So in my capacity at SafeBreach, and I've been here almost 3 years now, it's been an excellent journey learning the platform. And I say platform because we are a platform now, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we go through what some of SafeBreach clients and how they're operationalizing Propagate today. So before we do that, I like to level set, and there's a couple of things. I'm not on the sales team, so you're not going to hear me say blast radius, and you're not going to hear me talk about the threat landscape. However, what I will talk about is operational impact. And what I will talk about is threat-informed defenses, because knowing what's going on out there is really important to how we protect the organizations that we're responsible for. So consider this: an employee clicks on a phishing link Monday. By lunch that day, their domain credentials have been compromised. By end of the day, Tuesday, they started to move laterally to 15 systems, for example. By Friday, the entire production environment is now encrypted. This is a hypothetical story. However, in 2025, this is the lateral movement that we're seeing from adversaries on the breach analysis. So the average time now is 48 minutes. And this is changing all the time. It used to be in the back, long time ago, we would talk about dwell time where adversaries would sit in the network and learn as much as they can. Now they are more targeted and more focused. They learn just enough about your organization to find what's important and critical to you, and then start to move like adversaries do, laterally, and then ultimately holding your data ransom. The average dwell time now is about 48 minutes. So a couple of stats that we're going to talk about. So we definitely see in 2025, in this case, a 34% increase year over year for ransomware incidents. 1.8 billion credentials stolen in the first half of 2025. That's a 160% increase. Now, does that directly relate to the number of breaches? Maybe so, but I suspect that it has more to do with the number of records and number of accounts that are being breached in a successful breach. And then lastly, 84% of these breaches in 2025 involve living off the land tactics. This is where their adversary is using the tools that are available inside the organization. They're not custom building tools to attack Evil Corp 1. What we're seeing is they're leveraging the tools that are already there, and they're showing up at the front door with credentials already. So let's proceed to the next one. So what is Propagate? Shelly touched on this, and I just want to reiterate a couple of fundamental and foundational components that we can leverage to further our discussion today. SafeBreach is a platform now. For those that are familiar with SafeBreach, our flagship product in the breach attack simulation is labeled Validate. And Validate is when we're on our best behavior. We deployed a SafeBreach agent to reference infrastructure, and we have our deployed security controls, and we're testing against those controls to determine their efficacy. And I say best behavior because it's in a very controlled environment, and it's a static-based testing. Propagate is dynamic, which means that the attacks will modify based on the hosts that are discovered and the services that are available. So the dynamic nature of Propagate will find those endpoints that maybe don't have EDR deployed. So what is Propagate? It's post-compromise testing. So SafeBreach starts from assumed compromise. And we're not testing if they can get in, right? That's that initial access from the MITRE ATT&CK. Very important in the MITRE ATT&CK framework for tactics. However, really what we're testing is what is available to them after they get in. And this is where 80% of the attack originates from. Remember, they're leveraging binaries, living off the land. They're not necessarily spending a whole bunch of time beating down the front door because that's really noisy. They are showing up with your credentials and they're leveraging the tools that are readily available in your environment. However, they have more malicious means. So Propagate is all about real adversarial behavior. So SafeBreach is leveraging the same attacks and techniques that adversaries do to harvest credentials. In this case, harvesting credentials from browsers, lateral movement via RDP, WMI, and various privilege escalation techniques. These align directly to the MITRE ATT&CK framework that we see in actual breaches. If you're familiar with the MITRE ATT&CK framework, MITRE ATT&CK has sightings. I think the most recent version of their sightings is version 2, and it's a nice breakdown on what tactics and techniques they're seeing common across a number of breaches. And then lastly, it's in our name, SafeBreach, safe and automated. So Propagate's designed to be run in your production environment, not necessarily reference infrastructure. And there's huge benefits for doing that. However, there are some safety controls and some levers that SafeBreach utilizes for Propagate, including automatic cleanup, account lockout protection or prevention, which means if your default domain policy is, after the 5th login, we're going to lock your account out or even disable it if you're leveraging a technology like Defender for Identity. With regards to SafeBreach, you're able to, in the scoping engagement, I don't want to steal my partner's thunder when she does the demo, but you certainly can limit the number of attempts for logins to prevent that account lockout. So let's proceed to the next. So this is what we're talking about. How are organizations leveraging Propagate today? And I have a couple of use cases that we're going to talk about. This first one is network segmentation validation, or zero trust networking, or whatever they're calling it, flavor of the day. But most organizations have network segmentation on paper. Sometimes we have a flat network internally and a flat network in the cloud. That's for a whole other discussion architecturally. But typically we see service VLANs and VLANs separating things based on their use inside the organization. It's best practice. With regards to network segmentation validation, what we're actually doing is testing to see what's available to an adversary if they do get inside, and whether or not our security controls actually work. So we have a Propagate test plan. The entry point here is starting from a compromised system in the development environment. And SafeBreach answers a lot of questions. So we have a lot of technology bias. And oftentimes, if you're reporting to a board or senior leadership, they want to know that they're getting a return on investment for what they've spent on their security stack. SafeBreach can help answer some of those questions. One of the questions we're answering here, or assuming, is can the compromised system that's in the development VLAN actually reach production databases or financial systems or domain controllers, right? Expected result is no, they cannot. Our security gateways are configured appropriately and they're operating as designed. Or if they're not, what services are available and should we prioritize and spend our time and efforts protecting the assets that we're responsible for? So with regards to this use case, there's a financial services client. Development team had a system compromised through a vulnerable Node.js package. On paper, development was completely segmented from production. In this case, through active testing with Propagate, we discovered that the development servers could reach the production database over port 1433. SQL, right? So why? How could this happen? Well, a firewall rule was added 18 months earlier for a temporary data migration project. And that firewall rule was never removed. And without active testing, we are left with that assumption that the technology is working as designed. So in this particular case, Propagate helped identify an overly permissive firewall rule that was there for a purpose, but never cleaned up afterwards. Let's move to the next use case. So for this particular use case, we're going to look at everything, the big picture, what Propagate can do. So we're talking about here ransomware propagation scenario, where let's say Monday, somebody clicks a phishing link and the hacker has initial access and the race begins. And we call it a race because this is a race for time, right? You want to test your controls and be proactive before an adversary tests them for you, right? So this is about testing, finding those security gaps, identifying those deficiencies, understanding where we perform well, understanding what areas we need to focus on, and then getting there and batten down the hatches before adversary ever shows up. So our Propagate test plan, we're going to look at initial compromise. In this case, a user workstation, phishing victim, right? That's the initial access tactic. Then there's reconnaissance, where the network is mapped. We identify some of the domain structure and start to pick at high value targets. Then we leverage credential harvesting. This is what Propagate is all about right now. It's about harvesting those credentials and then moving with them laterally. So can those credentials be leveraged to compromise file servers, additional workstations? Can I leave something nasty in an SMB share? And when somebody else goes to read it, compromise them as well. And then lastly, privilege escalation, which is, can I elevate my privileges to do more things, right? And the privilege escalation requirement is because adversaries want to be persistent. They want to stay. They want to establish a foothold. So for this particular use case, we had a healthcare organization of about 2,500 employees. They ran the Propagate tests. They started from an HR workstation, because when we start with Propagate, we assume compromise, and we have what we call patient zero. And my partner will walk you through that in the demo. But we started from an HR workstation, harvested the domain credentials there. We're able to move laterally to 3 servers within the first zone. And from there, we reached a server with a cached domain and main credentials. At this point, it's game over, right? And you hear pen testers talk about this. Well, I can't believe how quickly I got to domain admin, right? They're going after those crown jewels. So that's game over in this one. It means complete domain access. At this stage, they could add service counts, they could modify, do whatever they wanted. But realistically and more relevant in a real attack, this is where groups like the Acquire ransomware group would deploy encryption across the entire network. So, and I say Acquire because it's very timely. SafeBreach has one SLA. It's within 24-hour period after there's a US cert alert or CISA advisory. That test or scenario is available for testing in the SafeBreach platform. Coincidentally, the most recent US cert alert was for Acquire ransomware. Let's move on. So we had 2 use cases. One where we identified that we could own the kingdom in the healthcare organization with credential harvesting and then lateral movement. And in the first use case, we identified an overly permissive firewall. So Propagate is really good at answering these 3 questions. Can adversaries move laterally across my network zones? Right? This is about attack path validation. And then what's the operational impact from a single compromise? And the benefit with Propagate is you can change the point of origin by changing who patient zero is. So we can start in Dallas and say, can Dallas impact and infect or impact Chicago operations? Can New York impact Los Angeles? And you can move the point of origin around, which is really cool about Propagate. And then, not that we recommend or are saying to replace traditional pen testings. There are some differences between SafeBreach's approach and traditional pen tests. First and foremost, SafeBreach is automated and repeatable. For those clients that leverage Propagate, can run it as much as you like. But here's how they're operationalizing it. We get the traditional pen tests come through either quarterly or annually, and they drop the report on the CEO or the CISO's desk. And then we get to work. Well, Propagate for SafeBreach clients, they're taking findings from that report, tuning their controls, and then validating and testing with BAS combined with Propagate and using it to test and test. One of the longest running jokes in pen test history is, hey, just change the dates on the report because it's going to be the same as it was last year, right? And we recognize that. And this is a game. Remember, it's a race about time. Having the focus and time to address those findings and prioritize them, but understand where you're performing well and where you're not performing well is very important. So, safe for production, it's built-in safety controls. When Shelly goes through the demo, she'll talk about the scoping engagement, which is the rules of engagement from a traditional pen test approach. We have actionable results that come out of SafeBreach tests with specific remediation guidance. And we also identify not just the gaps, but where you're performing well. This is one of the differentiators from SafeBreach and traditional pen test. Traditional pen tests can be a bit doomy and gloomy. Your control failed here, or this failed here, or inadequate this. Well, with SafeBreach, when you perform well, we're going to tell you, hey, we validated your security control. 80% of this was stopped, but here's the 20% that we need to focus on. And then lastly, the other running joke is checkbox security. If it is compliance ready, if you're performing active testing with SafeBreach, Validate, and Propagate, compliance is a byproduct of a good security program. With a good security program, you're generally doing things right and doing the right things in the right order. And realistically, compliancy is a byproduct of good security practices. And I think that's on to the next. That's it for me, folks. Thank you very much for your time and attention. Over to you.
Thank you, Andrew. That was awesome. Really interesting to hear about the customer experience and perspective from this. So without further ado, I'll share my screen. So this is here, those of you who are familiar with it, this is the scenario page in the attack section of our product. And in this scenario page, we can find the propagate section, which offers the attack path validation scenario, attack scenario, that is. When we enter this scenario, we're actually introduced to the propagate product in the platform. So what this wizard was going to do is going to configure all of the settings and environment configurations for the specific tests that I am going to run right now. So here we have a quick introduction. And the first thing that we're going to do is to select our entry point simulator. So let's take the Sentinel one for this test. And the real point here is to understand that this will be the only simulator in this test. So what Propagate does is it starts, just like Andrew explained, from the assumed breach scenario, meaning we have a compromised host in the network, in this case, the simulator, which we have advanced abilities on. And we're able to use it to execute the attack chain from it. So this will be our entry point for the test. All the other compromised hosts in this test will be non-simulators. We will not have any abilities on them that we did not achieve during this test. So after we've selected our patient zero simulator, we'd be able to select the subnet and the range that we want to run our test in. We can select the amount of time. Let's say we'd like to be 1 day, for example, and would like to select the type of content. So for this test, let's say I'd like to test specifically SMB-based propagation, SMB-based lateral movement, remote code execution. And be able to click next, view a quick review of everything that I have selected. I can see the scope, the time duration of the test. I can see what entry point simulator I'm going to be using, the content of the attacks, what lateral movement attacks are going to run, and I can name my test. We also have the password cracker ability here for the credentials that we're going to harvest that aren't available for usage for lateral movement as they are, but they need to be cracked. In this test, in this environment, the cracker is disabled, but many of our customers have it enabled. And the attack path validation, I'll add the date for today, and we'd be able to run the test. So once I click run test, I'm going to be transferred to what we call the propagate map. The propagate map is a visualization of all the events that occur in the backend of the test. So if there is some host that we're propagating to, I'd be able to see this host. If there is a host that has been compromised, if there are credentials harvested, if there is a lateral movement attempt, all is visualized in this live map. And it also preserved the ending snapshot, which you can analyze later, as we'll see in a minute. So without further ado, run test, and we're transferred. In a couple of seconds, the test will initiate. And of course, this is a 24-hour test, so we're not going to view it. But what we will do is we're going to view an identical test results. We went to the test results in the Analyze section of the product. We've gone to the Propagate tab. Propagate and Validate tabs are divided into different sections for more comfortable analyze. And we'll enter this test. So this test shows us with all the findings that were critical and low for this environment in this specific test. So I'm starting with the findings because in the end, this is where the value shines. In the end, you are running this test in a specific environment and you want to understand what you are exposed to, what an attacker was able to do and is able to do in your environment. So what I can see here is, first of all, the discovery phase, which, as Andrew explained, there is the discovery, the credential access, lateral movement, post-propagation, etc. So the discovery phase has is defined by different configurations and scanning. So we can see here that there were 23 hosts discovered with specifically with lateral movement ports open, meaning ports that can be used for remote code execution. We can see that there were users collected from the host and the domain, and we can see that something in the configurations allows credentials to be extracted from the LSAS process memory, the subprocess that caches credentials in Windows. So the next phase would be, we can see also different domain misconfigurations, but they don't seem that critical. So we'd be able to see at the top of the list that there were 2 admin credentials validated. Now that is pretty severe because that obviously allows propagation in the network under specific configurations, which, as we see in this environment, were implemented. And we'd be able to see in a direct direction that the credentials that can be extracted from the LSAS memory are probably the same ones that were extracted here from the memory. So if we go into the admin credential validated, which is essentially the one that we care about the most, we'd be able to see a very specific credential that was validated. We'd also be able to view the remediation guidance and the overview of this finding. So once we understand, we'd be able to go into the credential harvesting by memory extraction and search for the specific credential that we saw that was used, that was actually discovered as an admin credential, and understand that this is indeed the finding that we understood correctly. So this is the finding. We discovered the misconfiguration Next, we see that we have dumped the LSS process, as it says exactly here. Of course, we can also see the mitigations here for the next test. Next, we'd like to understand, was this actually what enabled remote code execution? And then we move to the lateral movement section of this findings report. So we'd be able to see that remote code execution has succeeded on 21 out of 21 lateral movement attempts, and that an agent, which kind of represents malware, has been successfully installed on 20. If we go into here, we'd be able to see how. So we can see that we use the SMB protocol and the credentials that were identified in the previous findings with this administrator user. We can see the remediation guidance for the remote code execution with SMB and the description. So this really tells this whole story. Due to the fact that the LSS process was not protected in this test, credentials dump of this process was possible and was executed. When we assess and gather these credentials and validate them to ensure that we do not cause lockout, we're able to see that the lateral movement was successful, which summarizes the entire flow, the attack path that has actually been validated in this test. You can see that there was one hash credential that was used for lateral movement, which is the same credential that we saw a second ago, and that the same credential was reused for all the propagation attacks, all of the lateral movement attacks. We can see it was reused on 21 hosts. So here we understand we have clear remediation guidance. We understand what has made propagation possible. And if we want even a more detailed report, we have our AI-generated test observations. So we can go and drill down into the metrics and understand exactly what was done in this test, how many simulations were successful, and we'll go into the simulations in a second, all of the test scope data, and the key observations. This is a generally new feature already adopted by several customers. It's in beta right now. So what we're going to see next is what I referred to earlier of the attack flow, which is actually the propagate map that we referred to in the previous when we run the test. So now we can see the compromised hosts, right? The 21 compromised hosts. Skull indicating an agent installed, red border indicating remote code execution successfully. You can also see that this is probably the host that we weren't able to install our agent on for some reason. So this is really interesting because it actually represents everything. And if we want to dive into the details, we're able to see all kinds of details about the compromised hosts, such as their IP, what ports were opened, their operating system, host name, etc. Next, if we'd like to go into the MITRE alignment, we can go into our MITRE attack board and analyze the results in the MITRE view. So for an example, if I'll go to the credential access, we already talked about how the most severe finding here was about the credential dumping. We'd be able to see that the operating system credential dumping is actually 90% not blocked, meaning that all of the credential dumping attacks, 90% was not blocked, which really correlates with the results of this test. And this is, of course, relevant to all of the tactics and techniques that are mentioned here. We can see that some were blocked, which are green, and some are red or orange, which were only logged or detected. If we want to deep dive and view all of the simulations, and specifically the ones that were not prevented, we'd be able to go and click and analyze all of the results, all of the actual simulations run that were not stopped by the security controls or for whatever other reason. This is the way for us to really drill down the logs, for you to validate, to get into the details. And of course, we'll always go back to the summary if we'd like to view in a nutshell what has happened. We can see that this test was defined as critical risk level, obviously because propagation was successful to many hosts using the same credential that was found in the same storage. We can see the amount of credentials in general. Of course, other credentials were collected as well, but we'll always propagate with the one that is validated and has the highest privileges. You can see that what ports were open and how the security controls have reacted in this test. Last but not least, we have our propagate report. If we'll go into the reports, we'd be able to drill into it select our test, and drill into the results. We'd be able to see most of the dashboards that we already saw, be able to see the summary that we already saw, and the findings, of course, the appendixes, and the remediation guidance as we already went through. This is, of course, the summary for stakeholders and management. That concludes the demo on our side. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Shelley, for that demonstration. Unfortunately, we are out of time, so apologies to those of you who have submitted questions. Please know that somebody from our team will follow up with you to answer your questions. If you have any additional questions or would like to speak with someone about attack path validation, SafeBreach Propagate, or any of the topics discussed here today, please do reach out via our website. We would love to connect with you. Otherwise, thanks so much for joining, and we hope you have a great rest of your day. Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.